So the reason that the podium is off to the side here is because there's a new camera in the back that is straight on. So the idea is rather than have me standing in front of the slides for the camera, it would work out better this way. But here's the part that we didn't figure on. Actually, we kind of knew that the next weakest link in the system was the laptop that was doing the broadcasting. But you take a new camera with lots and lots of pixels, and you try to force that amount of information through the old channels, and guess what? Something else breaks. That's kind of what we have this morning. So as a result, we're going back. When high tech doesn't work, you go low tech. So we're going back to the webcam. And those of you who are watching online, I apologize. You're not having the great experience that we anticipated. But that's, hey, we're living and learning. Just want to mention a couple of things coming up. First of all, tomorrow, ladies, Bible study, right? Joan, give away. If you don't know how to find Joan's house, see this lady back here. And it's not that far from here, just down the road and around the corner. And so, yeah, Carrie, do you want to say anything about that?
No, just there is another book.
Okay, if you want a Bible study book, Carrie has an extra there. Very good. Also, after the service today, John has been in the kitchen preparing a meal. We're going to have a fellowship meal here today. Restaurants are starting to open up. We're going to serve this meal instead of doing it buffet style. We'll try to make some accommodations, help everybody feel as safe as we possibly can. But we're going to have a fellowship meal, and then after that, we have our annual congregational meeting. So our fiscal year runs July through June, and the state of Pennsylvania requires that the members come together once a year and at the very least, approve a budget for the next year. So we're going to do that. But I really think annual meetings should be more than that. I really think annual meetings are a time to celebrate what God has done. And they're also a time to cast vision, to say this is where we come from and this is where we are going. So I would encourage you to stay for that. It will be more than just the budget. I promise you that. And also, I believe we're going to have some really good discussion. We had a wonderful discussion in our leadership meeting, what was it, already a week and a half ago, which we are going to then open up that discussion and have a broader discussion here in this time. So looking forward to that. Those of you who are members, we would like you to be there for that if you possibly can. Those of you who are not members yet but have been attending, please come. Please come. If you consider yourself to be part of this church, then we would encourage you to be part of that meeting. And you're going to, I hope, come away with a sense of this is our church. This is where we come from, and this is where we're going. All right, now to the morning message. I've had so many things going through my head this morning with technical stuff and congregational meeting and now to bring everything down and just focus on the message that the Lord has for us. Let's just stop and pray. Lord, right now, I don't have anything in myself. I need you. So Lord, would you take this message and make it a word that you would speak through me. And help our hearts to hear. And let your Spirit interpret for each one of us. But most of all, Lord, we want to just place you right now at the center of everything that we say and do. In Jesus' name. Well, in this year, 2020, our theme has been seeing spiritually, and what a year it's turned out to be. Somebody once said the biggest mistake of 2020 was buying a 2020 planner. Right? How's that going for you? Have any of your plans turned out? Maybe a few. We had the pandemic, riots. I don't know, the whole murder hornet thing never really worked out, did it? Has anybody seen a murder hornet? Okay, so yeah, so that was a bust. But what a year it's turned out to be. Fear is rampant right now. So many people are so afraid. And you know what? If we're going to be perfectly honest, that includes some of us. It's scary. It's scary. But here's the thing. If we are going to learn to see spiritually, then it reminds us that what we are seeing is not all that there is.
Amen.
So my question, whenever I find myself in a situation, my question is, what is God doing? What is God's perspective? I mean, maybe God didn't plan this. I tend to think that God does not plan bad things. That just doesn't fit with who I believe God is. But I do know that God uses everything. He turns things, turns bad things into good things. We talked a lot about that. So what is God doing? This summer I'm covering hot topics. Now, these are topics that the congregation has requested. I just about have a full itinerary. I might shift one or two yet, but I think I just about have them pegged what I'm going to be speaking on for the rest of the summer. This morning's topic was actually a question. And this is the question that was asked me. Is the fear of the Lord simply reverence for God? Or is it something else? Have you thought about that? What is the fear of the Lord? If you grew up in church like I did, we're often told in church that this doesn't mean that you're supposed to be afraid of God, right? Don't be afraid of God, but have reverence for God. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes in my mind, those things kind of conflict. Wait a minute, I'm not supposed to be afraid of God, but I'm supposed to reverence God. It's like, how is that not being afraid of God, and how does that all work? When we read the scriptures, when it says the fear of the Lord, I don't know about you, but to me, it sounds like fear. I mean, we're going to read the passage this morning, but God on Mount Sinai, fire, smoke. I don't know about you, that sounds like fear to me. The children of Israel were terrified to go up on the mountain and meet with God. So how do we reconcile where it says in Hebrews, our God is a consuming fire? How do we reconcile that with God, our loving Heavenly Father, who invites us into His arms? Here's my summary statement. The fear of the Lord is what happens when our human senses encounter a holy and almighty God. Our first reaction may be one of terror. But if you stay in His presence, the experience will transform you. I dare you. I dare you to stay in His presence. I dare you to resist every urge to run and hide from His presence. Just stay in his presence and let his presence transform you. Ultimately, it leads us to a deeper experience of worship. Let's take a look at the scripture. Breaking this down into categories. First of all, I want to talk about fear as an emotion. And we're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning in verse 22. We're going to look at the story that I just described. Deuteronomy 5, 22 to 26. These words the Lord spoke to all your assembly at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness, with a loud voice, and he added no more. And he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me. As soon as you heard the voice out of the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, you came near to me, all the heads of your tribes and your elders, and you said, Behold, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and greatness. We have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. This day we have seen God speak with man, and man still lives. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any more, we shall die. Who is there of all flesh that has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire as we have, and have still lived? Let me remind you that Deuteronomy is the retelling. It's Moses retelling the story of the children of Israel to them as they are getting ready to enter the promised land. So the pronouns you hear there are Moses retelling the story to the children of Israel so that they can hear again what was their response. And let me remind you too that repetition in the scripture is emphasis. Notice how many times in here it is repeated, this thought, if we see God, we're going to die. So, first of all, let's just begin with fear as an emotion, and let's just establish the obvious. Fear is the experience of being terrified. That word is terrified when you fill in the blanks. So what makes people afraid? Fire? Anybody afraid of fire in here? Darkness? Anybody afraid of the dark? Yeah. And a few that will admit it. Mysterious beings that we can't see. Loud noises. I can test that one out for you. No, please. You have all of those things here. All of the things that normally make people afraid are happening at one time on this mountain. Is it any wonder they were afraid to meet with God? But this is how the children of Israel were introduced to Yahweh. This is their introduction. I want to take you to a definition of fear. This is from Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible. It says, fear, an emotional foreboding or dread of impending distress or misfortune, often spoken of as the source of religion. Isn't that interesting? Yet fear alone can never account for true religion, since men are impelled to draw near unto God, the object of their worship. One does not desire to come close to the being that he fears. So there's the tension. There's the problem that I described. How is it that we can fear God enough to properly worship him and yet not fear God enough to come into his presence, enough to draw near to him? Fear, I believe, is that primal instinct towards self-preservation and self-protection. You know, we've learned to be afraid of things that may harm us. or things that have hurt us in the past. Some of you who have taken Elijah House may remember that when it comes to certain fears and phobias, they say some fears don't have a spiritual root. Some fears are not things that you can just simply pray through. They're things that you have to reprogram yourself for, adapt to, retrain your brain. They're behaviors which take time to unlearn. So in one sense, fear is an emotion that we need to learn to pay attention to because, hey, it might just save your life, right? I remember when I worked in construction, at that particular time in my life, I didn't have very much fear. And some of the guys that I worked with would complain about it. They said that my habits on the job were scaring them because I didn't have enough fear of what could happen. And then there's also the spirit of fear, like Vicki talked about this morning, over which we can take authority. Here's a scripture that you should memorize if you haven't already. 2 Timothy 1:7. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. So the enemy wants to take a good thing and make it excessive. Right? Fear is not necessarily a bad thing. Fear is something that we all should have in some measure. But what happens when that becomes excessive? Fear either takes over and we become controlled by those feelings of fear, or we become paralyzed. Feel like we can't respond, can't do anything. Paul describes fear as leading to bondage in Romans 8:15. And there are people, maybe some of us here, areas of our life where we're bound by fear. Here's the next point. Fear comes from encountering something bigger than you and beyond your control. Can we say it that way? Fear comes from encountering something bigger than you and beyond your control. When do we see God's people first learning what it means to fear God? So there was an event that happened before Mount Sinai, and an experience that laid the foundation for the people's fear of God. Here's, put this in my notes, and Carrie thought it was worthy of quoting, so we'll stick that quote up on the slide here. We don't fear what we can manage. Fear begins when our ability to control ends. Does that make sense? We don't fear what we can manage, but fear begins when our ability to control ends. Fear happens when our senses become overwhelmed, when we're threatened and our reasoning tells us that whatever is happening right now just might not result in our well-being. That's when we begin to fear. Our body tries to respond by releasing adrenaline, increasing attention, increasing blood flow to our muscles. I mean, there is a literal physical response to fear. That's supposed to prepare us to be able to meet that challenge. Now, if we assess and feel like we cannot meet that challenge, then what do? We use that same energy to be able to flee, or there's a third option. The third option is we freeze, right? We just simply hope that if we can lay low, maybe it won't notice us, right? That's the way fear impacts us physically. So let's look at what happened before Sinai. Go back to Exodus 14, verses 30 through 31. This is where the children of Israel are crossing the Red Sea. And this is what it says. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. And so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So you see what's happening there. Remember, fear is what happens when we are confronted by something bigger than us. So first, Israel was terrified by the Egyptians at the Red Sea. Here they are. They have a sea in front of them. They have an army behind them. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. This is a situation that is bigger than them because each, either the sea or the army, each of them had the power to overwhelm them. But then they learned something. They learned that God has the power to overwhelm the overwhelming. God has the power to overwhelm their overwhelming threats. Now the fear that they had of their circumstances gets transferred onto God. What we fear is a matter of what we perceive to be bigger. Whatever or whomever we perceive to be the biggest and most powerful influence commands our respect and rules our fear. Did you hear that? Whatever or whomever we perceive to be the biggest and most powerful influence commands our respect and rules our fear. You know, we talk about fear as bondage. You know, as I sat and spoken with people who were in bondage, let's say, for example, in bondage to a demonic influence, say, well, the only way you can be freed from that bondage is to give yourself over to someone bigger, right? You want to be free from this slave master that you have? Give yourself over to a bigger master. Give your life entirely to Jesus Christ. And tell that master that you now belong to him. Let them fight it out. Right? Here's the next point. Fear can also be an experience of awe and reverence. So the God who terrifies us with his presence also inspires our faith and confidence. In that sense, then, fear becomes reverence. Hebrews 12, 28 to 29. This is another passage you should know. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Worship with reverence and awe. I don't know what that means to you, but to me, it means that our worship here on Sunday morning is not just singing songs. It's not just a happy feeling, although, you know, that's good. It's good. It's not a cute activity. Our worship brings us into the presence of God. Do we have that sense just how big God is? It would do us well to be reminded of that. Now, it helps to know that God is on your side, right? Or rather, let me just correct that statement, or rather, that you are on his side. That's the thing about reverence. To say that the fear of the Lord is only reverence misses the point. Reverence is fear. Have we domesticated God by making him in our image? Has your God become tame? Something that you manage? Someone that you control? Then that's not the real God. Because the real God is, he manages us. I wouldn't say he controls us, except I know he refuses to do that. That's right. God doesn't need to respect us, but he does. Why? Because he wants to elevate us. He's not threatened by us. So who is bigger? You or God? Silly question, right? But do you act like you know the answer? Fearing God looks different as we learn to know him. But that doesn't lessen our fear of God. Here's a practical illustration. So last week my father preached a sermon. You all got to meet my dad. Most of you knew him already. I don't have to tell you that I have great love and respect for that man. But I also have a healthy sense of fear. You see where I'm going with this? 40 years ago, I could honestly say that I was afraid of him. And that fear kept me from doing many things that I shouldn't do. Right? I always knew he loved me, but I always knew, or at least I suspected, what he would probably do to me if I got out of line. Now, many years later, our relationship has changed. It's matured. I'm no longer afraid of what he might do to me. Seems pretty harmless, doesn't it? Dad, if you're watching, I love you. You see, that fear is irrelevant because I'm not a child anymore. However, I still care very much about what my dad thinks. You could say that my fear has turned to reverence. Right? Now, I may go on to do things that my father could never do. But I'll never be greater than my father. You know why? It has to do with origin. I can only be who I am because of him. It's because of him that I am who I am today. So that means I can never be greater than him. I can only be an extension of. I can only carry on what he has given me. He will always be beyond me because he was before me. But here's the thing. It's not a competition. See? I'm contributing to his legacy just as he has contributed to mine. Now, how does that translate into our relationship with God? Let's talk about fear in another way. Let's talk about fear as an incentive. And we're going to continue to read in Deuteronomy 5, beginning in verse 7. Go near and hear all that the Lord our God will say and speak to us, and all that the Lord our God will speak to you, and we will hear and do it. This is the people speaking to Moses. And the Lord hear your words when you spoke, and the Lord heard your words. This is Moses speaking to the people. When you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the words of this people, which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart as this always, to fear me and to keep all my commandments. that it might go well with them, but they're just saying this forever. So here's what I want you to get. First of all, I'm going to get very basic here, okay? There is good fear, and there is bad fear. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Fear as an emotion can either save your life or it can leave you paralyzed and helpless. Fear can be either terror or reverence. Either way, it's acknowledging that something or someone is greater than you. Whatever you fear has power over you. The Israelites at Sinai wanted to hear what God would say, but they didn't want to hear it for themselves. They wanted Moses to go for them. So they recognized God's power and they experienced God's deliverance, but they also wanted self-preservation. Isn't that the struggle for most of us? We want to know God. We want to hear what God will say, but we also have this bad fear that is afraid of what will happen if we get too close. Perhaps we should take some time to just sort out what is good fear and what is bad fear. Bad fear makes you want to hide. Good fear makes you want to respond. Bad fear is crippling. It's disabling. Good fear can be an incentive. It actually makes you want to do something. Bad fear leaves you feeling powerless and helpless. Good fear inspires hope and trust in God. Fear is good or bad depending on what it leads to, depending on the results. Since the fear of the Lord is an example of good fear, let's focus on good fear. What does the Bible say about fear? That is, the good fear. First of all, good fear is the basis for understanding. Psalm 111, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding. His praise endures forever. So this is what makes the difference between people who seem to know how things are and people who lack a good sense or direction. You can refer to these people as being grounded. Now, grounded, that's a term that we use a lot in counseling. What does it mean? Well, a grounded person is able to remain emotionally balanced and physically calm. In fact, we sometimes teach people who suffer from anxiety, we teach them to do grounding exercises. Grounding exercises can be as simple as just looking around you, using your five senses, noticing things. You know, what color are the chairs? You know, what's the texture? What do they feel like? What day is it? You know, when they pick you up in an ambulance, what do they ask you? They ask you, you know, do you know your name? Do you know what day it is? You know who the president is? Yeah, that's supposed to make you calm, right? It's supposed to ground you in the present. Help you to remember that you're in the here and now. Grounding exercises help people focus on tangible perceptions rather than the internal feelings that they have to help anchor them in the present reality. Bad fear is often an anticipation of what might be rather than a perception of what is actually happening. You realize that? Most of the things that we are afraid of in a bad sense haven't actually happened and probably never will. In counseling, we call this giving perspective. What is actually happening? And what am I merely afraid of? It means separating actual reality from what we may fear will happen and face each choice as it comes. Sometimes we need the help of another person to help us do this. We need somebody to talk to. We need somebody else to be able to hear ourselves speak out loud, to be able to separate feelings from reality. Having someone outside ourselves help us process and reflect can help to separate the good fear from the bad fear. Proverbs 1:7 says this, adding to this, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. It takes a certain amount of good fear in the form of faith and trust to even recognize bad fear and to get rid of it. You know, the way that we grow in faith and stability is to anchor ourselves in the reality of the one who is the ultimate reality. Anchoring ourselves and trusting God. God, you've got this. God, you're sovereign. God, I'm putting myself in your hands. You know, even in the 12-step programs, what is the first and second step? First step is, first of all, recognizing that you are powerless and your life is out of control. You can't fix this yourself. And the second thing is to turn to a higher power. Someone who is strong, who can help you, who can fix it. Good fear is the motivation for obedience. Obedience is that word. Let's go to Psalm 19:9. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So surrendering to someone greater than ourselves is the path to security and stability. Then this must also be the key to knowing how to live rightly. In fact, that was the whole purpose of the Sinai encounter. God was giving the people rules to live by. Now, God's rules are not arbitrary, but they help us to know what's best for us, how to live in harmony with God and others. And here's where good fear and bad fear play against each other again. Bad fear makes us obey for fear of punishment. But good fear sees rules and instructions as being, well, they're from our Maker. The person who made us knows how we best function and how we should live. So in this sense, fearing God is simply recognizing God as the one who made the world and the one who knows how it should operate. Right? Sometimes we've gotten this impression of God that God is some sort of cosmic killjoy that doesn't want us to have any fun. Where did we get that idea from? Oh, that would be the enemy, right? Truth is, God's rules, God's ways, well, that's how we live the good life. The life that God intended us to live. So what was God's response to the people? I missed something here. So our part is to align ourselves with God, to work with God rather than opposing His will. Now, next we'll go to Ecclesiastes 12:13. Remember the book of Ecclesiastes? Lots and lots of heady stuff. You know, asking all of the tough questions. You know, all of this. I've seen this and I've seen that, and it's all futile and none of it makes sense, and the world is a mixed up, confusing place. And then this is his conclusion. The end of the matter after all has been heard, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Okay. So the world is a mixed up, frustrating, confusing place, and things don't work the way that they're supposed to, and it all just seems kind of meaningless. But everything considered, fear God, keep his commandments. That's the whole duty of man. In other words, it's a way of saying, look, I can't explain why everything happens the way it does. I can't explain why some things are messed up because some things are just messed up, but this much I can tell you. Fear God. That is to say, keep God in his rightful place. Do what he tells you to do, and that is the best that you can do. So what was God's response to the people at Sinai? This part I call fear as a choice. You have a choice. Let's look again at Deuteronomy 5, verses 30 to 33. This is now God speaking to Moses. Go and say to them, return to your tents. But you, Moses, stand here by me, and I will tell you the whole commandment and the statutes and the rules that you shall teach them, that they may do them in the land that I am giving them to possess. You shall be careful, therefore, to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. You shall walk in all the way that the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land that you shall possess. Fear is a choice. Here's what I want you to get out of that. Relationships are based on good fear. You know what that's called? It's called trust. It's called trust. In the end, God decides to communicate with Moses. And then Moses should then communicate what God says to the people. Why? Because the people have more bad fear than they have good fear. There's no basis for a relationship without some measure of trust. If the people, let me put it this way, if the people are afraid that God is going to hurt them, why would they believe or follow anything that he says? Remember, the Israelites were slaves. And they had what's sometimes called a slave mentality. They were used to fearing, the bad kind of fear. But they were not used to trusting. They had lots of gods in Egypt, but they were used to appeasing their gods. That is to say, doing good things for their gods so their gods would do good things for them. But they hadn't yet grasped the concept of loving God. They were used to worship. They were used to worship as hype. Look at what they did around the golden calf. But they were not used to worship as a voluntary surrender. They were used to doing what they were told. But they were not used to doing it from the heart. So God is going to communicate with Moses. Why? Because God and Moses have sort of developed a trust relationship. And it goes all the way back to the burning bush where God was trying to give Moses some instructions and Moses didn't want to do it. And Moses learned along the way, like even along the way to Egypt, learned to obey God, learned that what God said was actually for his benefit. learned how to trust. So God could communicate to Moses. And then it was up to Moses to earn the people's trust, to communicate to them. Moses is going to spend the next 40 years teaching the people how to trust God. Here's something that I want us to explore. Fear in the Bible is a paradox. The paradox. Let me take you to a very curious verse. When we look at this whole thing, good fear versus bad fear, Exodus 20:20. Now this is the actual on the mountain thing. Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." All right. Heads exploding everywhere if you get a hold of that verse. Do not fear that the fear of him may be before you. Wait a minute, are we supposed to fear or are we not supposed to fear? What's this? Is fear a different word in the first list? No, it's the same. How is it that the Bible tells us not to fear, but to fear God in the same verse? I just gave you the answer. It's because there's bad fear and there's good fear. Right? We need to resist the bad fear. Resist the kind of fear that would keep us from God. But we need to embrace the good fear. His sovereignty, his majesty, his holiness. So this is a paradox. You know what a paradox is? Paradox is seemingly opposite truths, right? That you have to just kind of hold in tension. Now what happens when you hold these things in tension? Just like tension in the physical world, it creates change. A healthy hold of fear of God will transform you. It will produce wisdom and understanding as you consider who you are in light of who God is. It's going to move you to obedience as you align your life, your priorities, and your actions according to God's will. It's going to ultimately lead you to worship as you allow yourself to consider a God who is so far beyond you and yet loves you so intimately. Here's the last point I want to make. You have a choice to fear God or to fear, you know what that word is? It's actually two words. Everything else. You have a choice to fear God or to fear everything else. You have a choice to see God as greater than yourself. If you really think that you can manage the universe and that you have everything under control, you're in for a rude awakening sooner or later. When that rude awakening comes, we have the choice to react with self-preservation or to put our life completely in God's hands. We have the choice to trust God and to align with his will. Now, when I was just beginning in ministry, actually it was before I had any kind of position in the church or anything, I was doing an internship, a ministry internship. I was like early 20s, and one of the things that they made us do is they said so many leaders are afraid to go for counseling because they see some sort of a stigma attached to this, but we want you as a leader to learn to seek regular counsel. So they had all of us make an appointment with a Christian counselor they said, just find an area in your life that you'd like to improve and explore this together. So I thought about it. I mean, this wasn't something that I initiated, but I thought, well, I think I probably have some fears that are not really fears I should be having. So as I sat with the counselor, he said, like, what area would you like to explore? I said, well, I'd like to explore the area of fear. So we talked about it a little bit. We talked about some of the things that I was afraid of, and so forth. And then he says, since you are a student of the Bible, he says, here's the assignment I'd like to give you. I'd like you to take your concordance. This was before computer Bible programs. I'd like you to take your concordance, and I'd like you to do a word study on fear in the Bible. Now, if you've never done a word study before, this is how it works. You take the big concordance, not the little concordance in the back of your Bible, the big, heavy concordance, and you look up every instance of the word fear. In this case, it was the NIV. And made a list of all those verses, and I looked every one of them up, and I made notes on each verse. Okay, this is what I think it's kind of talking about. And then I got done all of that, and I looked back over my list of verses and my notes, and I was like, everything on this page fits in one of two categories. There were all of these verses that were talking about the fear of the Lord and fearing God. And then there were all of these verses that talked about being afraid of this, being afraid of that, being afraid of the other. When I went to my next counseling session, first of all, he asked me if I did the assignment, which I had. I was a good student. He said, well, so what did you learn from that experience? I said, well, basically I learned this. You can either fear God or you can fear everything else. That's the conclusion. You can either fear God or you can fear everything else. It depends on who you are going to see as bigger. Your problems or your God. Let's do some questions for reflection. First of all, when you read the Bible's instruction to fear the Lord, do you suppose that means moving towards God or moving away from God? Do you see God as someone that you would want to move toward? Why and why not? I tell you, if you are that person here this morning, you're saying, you know what, I am afraid to come into God's presence. I would urge you to just ask God why. And if you want to sit down and talk about that, I would be glad to explore that with you. Or Pastor Sandy or Carrie, any of us. I'd be glad to explore that with you because there's probably a reason. Secondly, do you recognize the difference between good fear and bad fear? Can you see examples of it in your own life? Maybe you didn't know that there was such a thing as good fear. There is. Not all fear is bad. How does focusing on good fear help you face the bad fear? Meditate on that for a while. Number 3, how much do you trust God? This is really the ultimate question. How much do you trust God? Does it comfort you or does it scare you to put your life in God's hands? What will you choose today? To fear God or fear everything else? Let's worship the Lord. Once again, in our services, if there's ever a time that you want to respond, if you come up to one of us in leadership, we'd be happy to pray with you. But if you just want to come and kneel before God and do your business with God, we respect that. I want you to just feel free to have that time. The important thing is not how you respond, it's that you